Hey everybody, day 51, and we're back with another of our series for the primer for anti-racist white educators. We've been through quite a few principles now. We're up to number 7, and that is?
Amplify.
So Amplify is really about the fact of trying to use your privilege to make sure that voices of color are heard in all different spaces. And sometimes that may be you repeating something that was told to you if you have permission from that person to be able to do so because they don't have access to that space. You know, like if a student is talking about, the lack of representation in curriculum, and then you have a meeting with the curriculum department, like you can amplify that concern in that space.
Yep. Sometimes that's literally giving a microphone to somebody else. And we had an experience with that with an assembly that a couple of student organizations here collaborated on, a Martin Luther King Jr. assembly, and we advocated for students of color to be the students behind the microphone on that day, which is just one kind of small example of how you might actually, literally, physically amplify somebody else's voice at your school.
Yeah, and I think ultimately when we talk about these systems that have been set up in our country, education, justice, whatever it may be, there's just not, like, the voices of people of color and those that are most marginalized in those spaces is not given very much of that space we talked about in a previous thing. And so how do you, and like we have 3% of our population is African American. And so if you're trying to, if everybody's looking at equality rather than equity, then a lot of times their voice doesn't get to be heard. And so how do you make sure to amplify, as a member of a group with privilege, of a group that makes up the majority, how do you amplify those voices that aren't given that by just the nature of the systems that we're in?
Yeah, and I think that's important to think about for faculty of color too. We know the numbers, and it's especially true here in Bellevue. We have a very few faculty of color. And so where there are opportunities for their voices to be heard, make sure that you're not taking up too much. Well, we're going to talk more about space later. Or did we already
talk about space? Yeah.
Space is one of the previous videos.
Yeah.
Try not to take too much space there, and that's kind of another way to think about amplifying their voice there. Or when you're in an all-white space, which is inevitable in our district, at certain times, taking the perspectives of teachers and faculty of color that you've heard into that space is valuable too.
Yeah, and I think going back to our last principle was accountability. And with this one, you want to be really careful because it's really easy to say that you're amplifying when you're actually just taking up space. And so, when you look at that, really try to check yourself of like who's getting credit for you saying what you said, or for you bringing that. If you're just telling people's stories as if like you own them and they're yours without actually passing the mic when you can, or without giving the credit and channeling that credit back to them, then it's become more about you than it has been about Amplify.
All right.
All right. Well, we'll see you whenever we see you next time together. I'll see you tomorrow. But keep coming along with the principles.
Thanks.
We'll see you.